Hello and welcome back to the Undercut podcast, and we are returning to review the third Grand Prix of the year, the Japanese Grand Prix. I'm your host, Jesse Billington, and joining me once again is none other than Mr. Thiemo Albers Daily. How are you?
Pretty good, thank you, Mr. Billington. Busy weekend, full to the brim with motorsport of almost every kind you can think of, so no rest for the wicked, but also it's been very enjoyable, and Japan wasn't half bad either. How are you?
I'm doing all right. I think I've just about physically recovered from my weekend. I say weekend, it was most of last week, really. I went and did the Three Peaks Challenge with some friends. But halfway up Ben Nevis, when we got to the waist-deep snow, we realised that was going to be a bit of a futile challenge. So instead split it up and essentially did one each day over the course of 3 days. Still damn knackering. And still somehow woke up at 6 a.m. on Sunday, despite the clock springing forwards here in the UK for daylight savings times. So woke up after like maybe 4 hours of sleep, I think, in the end of it. Um, Turned it on, watched the first half of the Grand Prix until Ollie Bearman crashed. Everyone ran out of electricity, so the racing functionally stopped. I went back to sleep, and then, much like I did for qualifying, woke up to see Kimi Antonelli stood on top of his car, happy. So I don't think I lost a great deal really in that entire process. But anyway, that's kind of moot. We are joined by Feeder Series writer Martin Lloyd. Welcome to the podcast, and how are you?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I'm okay. As Timo said, it was a really busy weekend of racing. There was the F1 that was on. There was a MotoGP and Moto2 and Moto3 as well, along with that. IndyCar in Alabama. So yeah, really enjoyed the weekend.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned MotoGP because I think this is the first time in quite a while, at the very least, that we've had an Italian win both the MotoGP round and the Formula One round at the same time. I can't remember when the last time that possibly happened in history.
Yeah, I think given the pace of that Mercedes and the sheer number of Italian riders in MotoGP, I think it's going to happen a little bit more often.
Certainly through the rest of this season, I'm gonna take a wild punt that no, because I don't think when was the last vaguely successful Italian F1 driver?
Well, probably Giancarlo Fisichella, but again, you're thinking, when was the last
Yeah,
time X thing happened? And then you're going to have to dust off those statistics in the record books. And now, as Martin's saying, we're probably going to then not forget that anytime soon because we'll just have like the last weekend to refer back to from now on for the foreseeable future. So it's nothing for 50, 60 years and then everything at once.
Yeah, then it all happens at once. Fisichella F1 results, they're going to be around here somewhere on this list.
Put it like this, but if you go for before Fisichella, I will struggle to name a successful one. And you just have
Um,
to adopt Michael Schumacher as de facto Italian.
yeah, Fisichella last win 2006 Malaysian Grand Prix. Obviously mentioned that when Kimi won in China. So would have been would Rossi have been at top flight MotoGP by 2006? I think he would have done just about. Would he been in 500s then, or would he still been 250s? Very good question. I'm going to take a punt that the last time we've had this happen would have been Fisichella and Rossi. But if anyone's just quick on the Google, they can check. Let's just see. Valentino Rossi. We're going to start with a bit of Googling. We love doing this on the show. Valentino Rossi.
I can tell you, as far as I can see, there was not a race on the day Jarno Trulli won the Monaco Grand Prix in 2004, so we can write that one off.
Okay, so maybe 2006. What was Rossi doing around that time in 2006? He was in 500cc at that point. So let's see. Results 500cc. Christ, there's a very long list. Here we go. We're all the way to the bottom. Motorcycle Grand Prix wins by Valentino Rossi. 500cc. We are looking for the Malaysian Grand Prix was 2006, 19th of March, 2006. Pooh, the closest we get is 8th of April 2006 when Rossi won at Loss Isle.
Yeah, say we probably shouldn't go further back than that because it's going to take longer than the rest of the podcast to find something if it exists.
Yeah, it's going to be quite a while going back. Yeah, we'll come back to that one. We've got a big gap of nearly a month to try and fill, so I'm sure we can do some historical
Fun
bits and
fact,
pieces there.
spring break is going to be longer than summer break.
Yeah. That's going to be an interesting one. We're going to have to do some filling there, I think, when we get to it. I say when we get to it, it starts now
We're in it.
off the back of the Japanese Grand Prix. So we might as well lean into the Japanese Grand Prix, dive into that, and have a look at what happened around Suzuka this weekend. And we'll kick off, as we usually do, at the top of the Constructors' Championship with Mercedes now. Russell qualified second, finished fourth. Antonelli qualified on pole and would go on to take the race win.
Yeah, Kimi Antonelli hasn't finished lower than second place so far this season, which I don't know if we're surprised at that knowledge, if we'd been told prior to the season, but it's damn impressive regardless. Despite that, though, the car isn't bulletproof, and I think that's what's giving the team certainly and the fans as well a bit of hope for the rest of the season. It's a dominant car in the making, but it's not ironclad just yet. The starts alone are proof of that. Russell's struggles, both in China a little bit and then here in Japan, show that whilst an incredibly capable driver is able to have a great success with it, it's not a guarantee that you're going to succeed. And it's these kind of vulnerabilities that Ferrari and McLaren are going to have to find some way to capitalize on. I'm not quite sure how beyond the start, but that's why they're the one dealing with that and not me, and I get to sit here and talk about it instead. Do you wonder though if Mercedes keep going the way they are, how long before we get a 2016 style season potentially from them, but with refreshed faces in the frame in the form of Russell and Antonelli? Russell is not going to be happy after this weekend. Two back-to-back losses to his younger teammate. And yeah, if he does beat him coming into the season, do we see history rhyme a little bit with maybe a Russell retirement from F1 or moving teams? You know, if we're saying just now that we're going to have something to talk about in the gap, why not get silly season kicked off early and say maybe Russell leaves Mercedes with a bit of a mic drop instead of waiting to be pushed out? Because if Verstappen comes on the market or someone else signs Piastri, even Gasly, if he keeps going the way he's going, it's going to be Russell on the chopping block, not Antonelli. So lots of potential for drama. And I know we're only at race three, and I know we've got about 6 months until Miami, but it's worth considering all of these sort of left field options that we normally wait until at least August to do when there is suspiciously little to talk about.
I don't think Verstappen will be coming onto the market in Formula One anytime soon. I think, given a couple of the interviews that he made after the Grand Prix, he doesn't look.
I entertain all possibilities.
Yeah, we'll see where he goes. Obviously, he's now got unfinished business, let's say, around the Nürburgring after his attempt at the 24 there was disqualified with, I think it was tyres that was the hurdle
One
there.
more set than they
Yeah,
were meant to
overuse of
use.
tyres. But yeah, I think Russell, I don't think Mercedes will be looking to get rid of him. The problem is he's ruthlessly competitive and ruthlessly efficient in what he does as well. He's a very good performer. If he was underperforming in sort of the same way that we've seen with Red Bull second seats, hugely compared to Antonelli, then maybe it'd be different. But if he's just banging in 1-2s, I can't see Mercedes doing anything different to how they'd previously done with
Would Russell be happy with being second fiddle?
Russell might not be happy, but I can't see Mercedes putting him on the chopping block. He might leave voluntarily. There's a big difference in that. I don't think Mercedes would be looking to get rid of him. He is ultimately one of their proteges. He is someone they spent a lot of time and money investing in and building up. I can't see them looking to get rid of him purely because they've got a second competitive driver. If he's suddenly very uncompetitive, different matter, but that's
There
unlikely.
was the debate with Verstappen last year, though, when he was looking around briefly, or the talk of it. So if anyone was going at that point, you'd still think it was Russell over Verstappen. So it depends on who becomes available, is the only thing I'm going to throw in as my small spanner there.
Well, that Russell chat was largely unfounded, though, wasn't it? It was speculation based off of the fact that sort of Max Verstappen had been on holiday vaguely near Toto Wolff, which isn't really sort of grounds for any meaningful journalism. And I say that as someone who really likes to sort of put things out with a pinch of salt at times. Back to the Grand Prix, though, I think Kimi Antonelli, the first Italian to win back-to-back races since Ascari in 1953, and the youngest driver to ever lead the Formula One World Championship. It's really interesting that we're sort of seeing these new bits of the history book be sort of rewritten by this kid. And the BBC's Andrew Benson regarded Antonelli as not on Russell's pace at the moment, coming into the weekend. It was some really interesting sort of look at it, and I think it would have been fair to have said that off of the back of the two Grand Prix we'd seen to that point. It's a fair assumption to make. I think China, he had sort of a bit of a luck of the draw when it came to the strategy. Australia, he simply wasn't close enough. But then this weekend, that's turned around, and I think he's now a strong title contender and one that I think Russell knows he's got to face. If you looked at his body language after the Grand Prix, the fact that he was seen walking around still with his helmet on quite some time after sort of the race ended and they'd done the weigh-ins. Usually drivers are pretty quick off with the helmets, but Russell sort of very much stormed off, not happy with the way that his weekend had panned out. Clearly, it's going to be something that pushes him to find a new level. Overall, though, I think it was a great run by both drivers, and clearly it's still a power unit that struggles to build at the start, whether it's charge, whether it's boost, whether it's a combination of the two, whether it's the sort of mechanical system that links the engine to the gearbox to the rest of the drivetrain that just means those starts are tricky. Russell's got a better handle on them than certainly Antonelli does. If you watch back Kimi's start from Oscar's point of view, it's a huge burnout off the line. Great if you're doing some sort of performative start at the Goodwood Revival, not so good for Formula One. And the actual car itself is tractable and pliant enough, and it's close enough with Ferrari on outright pace when you look at them on a chassis to chassis basis. And yeah, a good front row lockout, a clean drive. But the problem they've now got is McLaren have sort of figured out the power units as well, and they're going to be chasing them down. Alpine have very much figured out what they're doing with the power unit and don't seem to have quite such a pig of a chassis as they've done in previous years. So as we've seen previously, Mercedes do sometimes get beaten by their suppliers. It's been, well, certainly the last 2, 3 years they have been. It's going to be an interesting one. And I think there's a lot to look at when it comes to Mercedes moving forwards. The car also struggles in a scrap and it gets pulled down a lot to the pace of the cars around it. It's not a car that's able to drag someone along with it. And it very much sort of ends up tumbling back through the order. I think it's very interesting that we're back to where Mercedes might have been aerodynamically or race dynamically in 2020, I want to say it would have been, when we saw both Mercedes cars of Hamilton and Bottas stuck in the field at the Italian Grand Prix, unable to make progress. It's really interesting we're seeing a car that can catch up to the back of other cars and drivers, but then there's something about its chassis, its dynamics that sort of show that it's really meant to be a leading car. It's not too bad when you've only got 2 or 3 cars ahead of you off of a bad race start, but when it starts to tumble down the order, that's when we see these long-term scraps come forwards. That's why Mercedes is going to have to really be on it when it comes to their strategy calls. They nailed it in China with the double stacked strategy, and in Japan it wasn't quite so clear cut. Kimi very much sort of got the rub of the green when it came to that sort of safety car pit stop. So yeah, it's going to be interesting, but again, we're trying to make all these judgments based off of 3 sort of races. That's not really enough scientifically speaking to draw any meaningful averages. So I can say all that, but functionally, mathematically, generally speaking, in a sense of accuracy, it's not worth anything.
No, absolutely. I agree with you on that, and I think especially your point about the car not being not being good in a scrap was really an interesting one. And I think we're probably going to end up talking about the regulations quite a lot today, but I think it also harks back to that as well as potential flaws in the aerodynamic design. Because in previous years, for example, in 2020, okay, maybe Verstappen would pass Hamilton if he'd qualified at the front as you'd expect, or Bottas would maybe get passed by McLaren at some point in the season. But they generally at some point would get back past, and they wouldn't drop a long way back. They wouldn't drop 3 or 4 places. What we're seeing at the moment is the ways in which those powertrains are working with the batteries, and the different variations in how much each driver is deploying is suddenly there are these big swings in position that are very, very possible. I think Lando Norris on Sunday had a big drop in the early part of the race, dropping a few positions just because at that point in the race he had less battery and wasn't able to defend, and also potentially aerodynamics wise as well. And I think it's a very interesting part of the new regulations that maybe isn't talked about enough in terms of, yes, there's driver on driver, man on man, individual passing that is taking place, but also whole groups of cars are getting past each other where there just wasn't that level of battling before, which I'm finding really, really interesting. It was something that Antonelli struggled with, obviously, at the very start when he got absolutely swamped. And you have to say there was a little element of luck about his win this weekend, in terms of that safety car timing. But there's a big difference in having a lucky win handed to you with a couple of laps to go, like, say, Sergio Perez and Baku in 2021 when Max Verstappen had a tyre failure, and Lewis Hamilton left the brake magic button on. There's a big difference between that compared to picking up the lead mid-race and then absolutely storming into the different distance. I think once he'd reclaimed that lead that he'd originally only held for a few meters, it never looked as though he was going to lose it. And I think it was just an incredibly impressive drive. It showed that what happened in Shanghai really wasn't a fluke. It's win, pole, fastest lap, 2 weekends in a row, and he's really stamped the marker down at Mercedes now. I think the really important thing, almost less than the driver performances, than the luck at Mercedes at the moment, is the shift in momentum that this brings. Because, as you talked about, there's that 5 week gap now until Miami. There's not a race weekend next week or in 2 weeks or even in 3 weeks. This is going to be playing on George Russell's mind for over a month. It's not going to be ancient history like it would be when we have a couple of triple headers in close succession. This is going to be the most recent event is that he's been beaten twice in a row by his teammate, and that is going to sting. And I think that is potentially the most important intra-team thing that's come out of this weekend for Mercedes. Russell was clearly very, very quick as well, and this will be pretty disappointing for him. It was an opportunity he really ought to have taken, being ahead of his teammate, especially after Antonelli had taken pole to at least increase his lead on Antonelli. Again, that luck with the safety car played a big part, but still, with Russell down where he was after the safety car, and the pace that he'd shown over the weekend, you'd kind of expect him to maybe pick up a podium, and to only finish fourth and now be 9 points behind Antonelli, the first Mercedes driver not to finish on the podium in a race this season, in a Sunday race, I should say, is very, very interesting. And as I say, in terms of momentum, I think that will be a bit of a blow. It's very, very early in the season, of course, 3 out of 22 races, throughout 3 out of 22 rounds, I should say. But still, it's not a weekend that George Russell will look on fondly.
The
I
technical
think to
side
add on to
is really interesting because it's almost like we're watching Formula One in reverse to IndyCar. With Formula One, you use all of your essentially push to pass in the first half of the Grand Prix. And if you were watching, obviously you mentioned at the start you were watching Alabama with the IndyCar there, we saw David Malukas getting to the end of the race with all of his push to pass left almost, and sort of being able to deploy it and really put the pressure on who was it who came third? I can't remember the fella's name off the top of my head. Old fella, was
Rahal?
he? What was
Liam
it?
Rickle.
Ryan Rahal, yeah.
Yeah, Rahal.
Yeah, and you sort of end up with this really interesting way of balancing energy. But IndyCar has found a way of making it more interesting, more understandable, and one that genuinely promotes very interesting racing. And obviously, they've recently-ish moved over to a hybrid powertrain. They found a way of still keeping it very natural racing. And yes, you do get your push to pass passes, but you still have to do a lot of very physical racing to get up close to the driver ahead of you and be ready to make that overtake. And I think Alabama was a really good example of that. You look at how the drivers are having to adapt and approach certain corners, taking different lines to get up close to the driver ahead, and then either hope that the other guy gets a bad exit or hope that you get a really good one before you even think about deploying the button. And with F1, we sort of just blow through that in the first half. And I sort of said at the top of the show that essentially after that, once you've run out, things very much lock in. But the flip side of that is it also really shows this very interesting dynamic to Kimi Antonelli, is once the racing, everyone's run out of electricity and everyone's on a very level playing field, the fact that he is able to then somehow just keep extending that lead away and showing the performance that he can innately find in the chassis, innately find in the car, using the limited amount of power that they're able to harvest over a lap and then deploy over a lap. The fact that Kimi can find that, do that, manage that, and just keep pushing away and away and away. And if you look, his fastest lap was not set when they had full batteries and full sort of fuel tanks at the start of the race. It was set way down the line. Obviously, the car's a bit lighter, the track's evolved a bit across the space of the Grand Prix, but you haven't got that huge amount of electrical power that you essentially built up at the start of the race. Kimi's able to somehow make that difference very late on in the Grand Prix when in other locations around the circuit, you've got the likes of Pierre Gasly essentially just being able to sit there and Max Verstappen cannot get past him, which in previous years would be almost unheard of. So all of a sudden, you've got this very neutral playing field and you've got one driver that is visibly excelling at it. And it's not like the other drivers that are in clear air aren't getting close to setting quick lap times or aren't being able to charge up the back of someone. They're just stuck. But Kimmy's able to find something. And I think this is the thing that's going to prove that he's a huge threat essentially to George Russell. And you're a really interesting point when you say that this is going to weigh on George's mind because he's got 5 weeks to just sit there and go, last thing I did in a Grand Prix 2 times on the bounce was lose to my teammate. And that's going to be on the one hand weighing on him, but the other side of it, it can be positively spun to be a huge motivator. And I think Mercedes are a clever enough team to be able to balance that and manage that. They've already said that they're trying to quell people talking about the fact that Antonelli could make a championship charge in only his second year in the sport. And we're like, where have we heard that story before? Let me think. But I mean, it's a really interesting one to look at how this is going to impact two very interesting drivers, two very technical drivers who have very unique driving styles in a car and a team that is known for managing its drivers very well, certainly since 2016, let's say.
I think those are the two interesting points that you made, Martin, is that Kimi's able to do that. Is anyone else outside of Mercedes able to do that? You saw Piastri streak off early on in the race and build a bit of a gap, but nowhere near to the same extent that Kimi was able to. So even if you put one of the Ferraris or one of the McLarens, for argument's sake, in that first position and you have some squabbling behind, it's not as much of a guarantee, maybe, as it would be if you put that driver in a Mercedes. It goes back to how much of it's the car, how much of it's the driver. But then you see the difference in ability and experience between Russell and Antonelli, and you go, well, if you'd put your money on which one of those drivers would be doing that prior to the start of the season, you'd have probably gone for Russell simply because he's just got way more experience, more time with the team, all of these things. And you say about that it's weighing on Russell. It does have that, but again, you have then Miami is this next venue where Antonelli got his first sprint pole last year. How much is that going to weigh on both drivers' minds? And it's an interesting one because you have a positive and negative momentum that you can carry forward. But when you have that big gap, yeah, it can weigh on your mind, but it also means that, yeah, if you're Antonelli, you've got a lot of time to still deliver that. Whereas Russell can maybe go, okay, that didn't go to plan quite as the way I wanted it to, but if you can harness it in the right way, you've then got a race with a bit of a gap, but then you get into that very quick summer part of the season where the momentum, like you see in Formula 2 more often, Martin, where you have races to a weekend and then that summer period as well in Formula 2 is incredibly busy. You see where that positive and negative momentum carries in and which drivers it helps to turn things around and which ones it really hinders. So that's going to be quite interesting to watch as that goes. And then you've got the extra element on Russell's mind of he's been beaten by his younger, less experienced teammate who's Toto's new kind of wunderkind. But you were the one who beat the 7-time world champion consistently. So what the hell do you do with that?
Yeah, I find it really interesting in that sense, in that dynamic mentally on both sides. And I think I'm going to talk a little bit about mindset later with Max Verstappen. But I think with Kimi Antonelli, potentially part of it, if we're talking about mindset, is that for him, this change is not as big. Now, of course, he's been in the junior formula, which is all traditionally powered, but he's only been in Formula One for 1 year with the 80-20 hybrid split. If he's going to 50-50, okay, that's a big change for him, but it's not like he's been in the sport for a decade, 2 decades, some of these guys, where this has just not been a factor whatsoever. It's not like he's been in it like George Russell has. I think this is Russell's 8th season, where this is actually making fundamental changes to a driving style that's been honed for years and a driver who's approaching the prime of his career. This is Kimi Antonelli, who is just changing after a year. Okay, 30% more battery power. It's going to be a challenge, but actually, I think I can adjust to that. I've still got probably 15 years in F1 if I want it, and I think that might even
I think that's the
be a
worrying
part of
part
it.
for Russell, though, is that Antonelli's
Exactly.
just going to get better. And Antonelli doesn't have that
Exactly.
pressure, whereas Russell could find himself in not quite a Norris situation from last year, but a similar version of it, where if you don't win the title this year, when are you going to do it? Because it's going to become trickier from this point on.
Exactly, especially considering this was the car that was meant for Russell, right? Obviously, Antonelli came along, but this was after he was meant to be promoted eventually and almost be given a champion seat as Mercedes had been winning for so long. Suddenly came up, suddenly they weren't winning. But after 4 years of waiting, this is his big chance, and it's almost like that famous quote, "I was the future once," with someone else coming in and taking the reins.
It's a really interesting one. I think obviously the whole thing has to weirdly come with this caveat of the fact that we've got this sort of really interesting season starting up, and previously we've been able to sort of very accurately predict it because we've had sort of very clear and open testing. We've had sort of an understanding of where the cars and the drivers are at. But because we're at the start of this new season with these relatively unproven regulations that seem to be throwing more and more spanners into the works every weekend, we'll get onto that when we get to the likes of Haas and Ollie Behrman. It's tricky to make with any certainty a professional level of predictions. You just have to go, this is what we've seen, this is what we could see coming, but that's based entirely off of three very different data sets where reliability is still an unproven concept, where the tractability of these cars over a long period of time is an unproven concept. We still have sort of, well, I think this is the first weekend where you could reasonably say that the Aston Martin had the chance to make it to the end of a Grand Prix, as did the Cadillac without any major issues. But that's the first out of three Grand Prix weekends, one of which was a sprint where we should have had even more track running. And we've only just proven that these cars can do a Grand Prix without engine covers falling off or them shaking the driver to pieces. And that's really stretching it. So we're sort of at a very unproven time. And I think we're just going to have to see sort of what comes of it after the spring break, when hopefully we get a good run at sort of obviously a few North American circuits, and then get back to sort of roots with some sort of more traditional European circuits as well.
The last bit I've got to say before we move on is that we're also going to a lot of venues, starting with Miami. I think the only exception in recent times that I can remember, and even one of them is a bit questionable, with Austria and Spain. All of the other places, we have seen rain a lot of the time, and we don't know how these cars behave in any kind of wet weather yet. So that could be a whole other kettle of fish to throw into the mix.
Yeah, a very tricky to deploy power unit, and wet weather could sort of again unmask some issues, and again be one of those moments where we say this is what separates the men from the boys, and we'll wait and see. Canada has been known to be a bit
Monaco,
soggy. Monaco can be a wet
Miami,
race.
Silverstone,
It's
Spa.
not unheard of for Spain to be wet, neither is Austria for that matter as well. So we've got a lot of wet still to come. Zandvoort as well, which comes in what, just at the start of the second half of the season.
Hmm.
We've got
Budapest.
Budapest as well, also known for being wet, famously with Bottas bowling and the likes there. So I mean, there's yeah, there's still this great risk that we're going to see a hugely unpredictable season. That
Well, I'm saying between that amount of rain potential and you questioning my long podium list for drivers for the season, it could still happen. There's a lot of these instances where I just need survival to be on the cards, and I get a bunch of drivers no one was expecting to be on the podium.
survival in a wet race is a bold strategy, and well, I mean, now we know that
Well, if you're the bottom three teams, you'll take that right now because it's all you've really got.
it's the only strategy you've got. Meanwhile, when it comes to strategy, the kings of screwing that up. Ferrari, Hamilton Q6, P6, Leclerc qualified fourth, finished third. And compared to last weekend, this could be seen to be a bit of a bum weekend, especially with McLaren now edging into the top three as sort of a team now. But both drivers in the top six isn't a bad outcome. Leclerc on the podium and both of them having a tidy scrap as they go was exciting. A bit quieter than previous, but not necessarily a bad outcome. If McLaren can keep building, Ferrari will have to respond and try and keep that to try and keep a hand on the title options. But I think so far, this is not a bad weekend for Ferrari.
No, and I think while it was a shame that Hamilton, for example, couldn't keep hold of P5 at the end, and while he and the car didn't look as comfortable with the circuit as they did in Austria and China, he and the car together still looked to be an effective team. So it was just the circuit in itself wasn't to their combined liking, but it wasn't as if it was there was something wrong with Hamilton or the car. It was just some tracks going to be better than others, and you're going to have to deal with that as we go on. And like you say, if this is a bad weekend for them, then you're still moving in the right direction. And you say Kings of screwing up strategy, but they didn't really screw anything up this weekend either. So that's also something that we like to say and is not a challenge for them for the future. And to top it all off, the overtake that Leclerc put on Russell going into turn one, we're going to still be talking about it at the end of the season, one way or the other, um, because it was just the difference maker between you may have arguably the best car on the grid, but I want it more, and I'm willing to go balls out for it. And those two drivers, we've talked about them a lot previously about when are they ready to fight for a title? Was Leclerc really ready in 22? In hindsight, I don't think so. I look at his season in 24 and go, that showed for me he's now ready and more than able to fight for it. Russell then had a Leclerc style year last year to show that he was ready, and now we're seeing that played out where they both potentially have the car to win the championship. Again, 3 races in, who knows what's going to happen? And you'd still argue more in Mercedes' favour. But if Mercedes have a ding dong between the pair of them, Ferrari aren't that far behind. And as we saw at the end of last year, you only need to win by 1 or 2 points to still be a champion. And Leclerc's gonna, if he's doing that in round three to get a podium, you bet your ass he's going to try and do that wherever we have the last race of the year, if it means that he can have a shot at getting a title.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was for me the biggest plus point for Ferrari this weekend, as well as obviously the podium for Leclerc, was the confidence that both drivers had in this car, both battling with each other and with other drivers. As you as we alluded to earlier, one of Lewis Hamilton's biggest problems with this Ferrari, or with Ferrari last year, was he was just unable to really get that secure, consistent confidence that he was able to drive it in the way that he wanted to. And that's a problem he had with that those last few Mercedes as well. And it just didn't suit his driving style. It almost seems like we're seeing the old Lewis Hamilton back in terms of pulling those moves. He pulled a similar move, I think, on Norris. He was repassed as the one that Leclerc pulled on Russell, but it showed that ability is still there, and when the car's there, when he's got the confidence in the car, he can still pull off those really impressive moves. And I think that showed me that Ferrari, in terms of this partnership, have got something really strong. You pair that with a car that has proven it's probably the second best on the grid at the moment. I know the McLaren was very strong, but I'd want to see a bit more from them to say that in terms of both reliability and aerodynamics, it's as good as a Ferrari as well as better. I think they've got the second best car. I think they've got an incredibly strong driver lineup, and this is meant to only be the prologue in their season, to use cycling or theatre terminology, with Fred Vasseur, I know, promising some upgrades for Miami, and Ferrari being quite bullish on what their hopes are post Suzuka. You'd hope, if you're a Ferrari fan, okay, 3 podiums in the first 3 races, and then we can move and we can start really challenging for wins. We can, as you were saying earlier, we can move out of challenging in the first half of the race, and we can really go for it and see if we can try and move with strategy against Mercedes on lap 40 or lap 45 at the next race, and really try and strike a hammer blow. I think it's maybe slightly disappointing for them that they weren't the clear second best team in Suzuka, but you're never going to finish third and fourth, at each one of these first 3 races, especially with teams as strong as McLaren finally in the mix. And as I say, those drivers seem absolutely at one with the car in a way that Ferrari drivers just haven't consistently together for quite a long time.
It's going to be an interesting one for Ferrari to sort of build on as they move forwards. And again, I look forward to, like you said, this being sort of a prologue. I think a lot of teams will have treated these first 3 races, especially now we've got this big break, as sort of a chance to come into Miami revived, refreshed, looking at things completely differently. We've seen teams do this previously when there's been sort of big gaps between the opening few races and then suddenly re-emerge very differently. I'm feeling that I think it was sort of Force India, certainly in its Racing Point days as well, also had a habit of doing this, of sort of coming along to the first couple of races very underprepared and then going, right, I think we've figured out what we're doing now, and then turning things around. So maybe there's also hope for Aston Martin in that sense of things if they're able to carry that forwards. But For Ferrari, having this little pause is going to be really useful. They haven't performed badly so far, but I think this gap will be useful for them to sort of take stock and see where they've gotten to. But it also does lead us nicely into the fact that McLaren are sort of up there still. They're third. Piastri qualified third this weekend and then finished second. Norris qualified fifth and would finish fifth. And the reliability seems to be back. We've sort of obviously they don't get a say with how reliable those engines are. They buy from HPP and just have to see what they end up with. But Andrea Stella admitted that the chassis performance still isn't there. But he also runs a very high bar with what he expects from the team from that car's performance. And clearly this weekend around a very technical circuit, one designed by Honda to showcase what a chassis can do. Both drivers are able to get a lot from the car dynamically, but still not meeting what Andrea Stella thinks it should be able to achieve. And he comes from that technical background. He is an engineer at heart. So I think there's a lot more room for this McLaren to move into, which is partly why I'm sort of concerned that Ferrari, if they take their foot off the gas, will struggle to try and sort of keep up with McLaren, because we've seen McLaren develop their way through a season before, and it's frighteningly technical when they actually sort of nail it, and it's impressive as well. Battery reliability, though, could be a big hurdle this season. Lando already running very low when it comes to those spare battery items, one to watch with the other HPP supplied cars as well. Obviously, Mercedes will have a better read on things. It's most likely going to be sort of battery units that they're familiar with supplying to other people. But when it comes to the likes of Alpine and Williams, especially, if they have a crash, if they get through battery power units when they're sort of overstressing the car with its heavier workload, we could see some sort of bigger reliability issues and grid penalties creeping in.
I think their main issue as well, still, and again, it's the awkward thing of having three races where you have the issues they have, is now just building consistency. You had one car finish the first race, you had both cars not even start the second. And so this is the first proper race where you've been able to have smooth running. And it was very smooth running. You had both cars in the top five. But you need to now make sure that you can repeat that and use this spring break wisely to ensure that whatever the issues you were having in that second race in particular in China don't come back to get you. And what similarities might the Shanghai circuit have to other ones in the future where that could pop up again if that's an element or whatever else is at play. And it kind of was summed up by Piastri post race. Like, when we get to start these things, we're pretty good, but you do need to start them. And that's weirdly where the problem is at the moment and where the consistency comes in. And Piastri also gets the spoils of being the first non Mercedes or Ferrari driver to get a podium this year, which for his battle against Norris, he's not started the first two Grand Prix of the season, comes into the third one, out qualifies him, beats him in the Grand Prix, doesn't really have to deal with him at all during the race itself, and never looked under threat leading the race at one point. He's quietly comfortable again and doesn't have to worry about Norris just yet. And crucially, they're not in a position that they were in last year. So if you're Norris, you can't rely maybe on the team having your back more than Piastri, because there's no point for it yet. There's no need for it because you're just trying to survive.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, as you say, seeing McLaren outside of that championship dynamic, modern McLaren, um, because I think there's a lot of weaknesses that we saw last season in terms of potentially operationally, and a lot of strengths in terms of technical design. And I think that's, as you say, uh, Jesse, I think that's going to really come to the fore later this season. In terms of, I think that car is very good. We know that the engine, if at the moment they can't make it work reliably, we know that that powertrain is very strong, as proven by themselves, Antonelli, Russell, Alpine to an extent. So there's a hell of a lot of potential there. For me, I think it's a boost, pardon the pun, that was sorely needed, and I think it's a real morale boost, as we say, talking about momentum for the next few weeks in Woking. But there is a very long way to go, and I think that main test for me will be seen when they are engaging in perhaps some kind of strategy challenge, or maybe even they're in a battle for a win with both drivers and they see which driver do we prioritize. Have they learnt from last season? Have they learnt to put all their eggs in one basket? Have they learnt to be strong in their decision making, not necessarily asking the drivers if they've got all the data on the pit wall and the drivers have just got the TV screens on the track. Once I can see if they've learnt those operational things, when they could still very feasibly be in a much closer battle for a constructor's title and a driver's title with maybe even three or four other drivers from other teams, then I will be, I think, much more confident about their prospects. I think last year their technical side was so good that it carried them through and meant that um, Max Verstappen just came up short. I don't think they're going to get that luxury this time if they make some of those mistakes. I'm confident in terms of what I've seen results wise from the race, the half the races that they've started, and being up in fifth and sixth, having only started three races between your drivers proves that. It's just a case of whether they've come over those hurdles now, having won a few championships and are really ready to compete in a tight battle with both Mercedes and Ferrari. Because if McLaren are up there, you can probably bet towards the end of the season that both of those teams will also be up there as well.
Because obviously Mercedes we know operates at a very high level. We've seen previously even when they've not had a constructors winning car. So look back to sort of the change of the regulations 2022 through sort of until 25, that car wasn't perfect, but the way the team operated around it, the way the team sort of motivated one another, its sort of pit stops were still very good, very technically competent. The way that it built over a weekend was still fantastic.
Just look at Silverstone 24.
Yeah. McLaren, while they might be able to technically turn that car around, they've still got to be able to have the rest of the team perform to get close to essentially what is going to be, as a constructor, their closest rivals is the people they buy their engines from. If they're close enough to it and they're able to sort of match them team by team performance across the weekends, we're going to see a very interesting constructors championship start to sort of bake out in this one, especially if we've still got Ferrari in that mix. And again, we still don't even know whether Red Bull are going to get themselves back on track. They have yet to even get past fourth places. Haas, where we saw Ollie Behrman this weekend qualify 18th, unfortunately would not finish the race with a crash. Ocon qualified 12th and would make it into the points, finishing 10th. Still fourth overall for Haas is a really impressive showing early on in the season. And sort of they're no longer being chased by Red Bull, but by Alpine, which is odd. Nonetheless, though, a bit of a bum weekend for them. And again, this is a bit like Ferrari. The problem is we're contrasting this to the two previous outings we've seen for what that car and that team, and certainly one half of the garage, can do. And look at the sort of results we saw from Ollie Behrman in Australia and China, where we know that he's very quickly got to grips with this new car, this new style of racing. We know that the team are able to put together a relatively solid weekend by the look of things. They're well motivated. Komatsu is steering that ship so well at the moment that it's really exciting. But then it all fell apart for Behrman this weekend, wasn't able to get comfortable with that car around a very technically demanding circuit, and then fell further back when he was hoping to get past a slow-moving Franco Colapinto, hit with a bit of super clipping on his way into Spoon, and just had to take avoiding action. And that's not his fault. That was not really a crash that he caused. It wasn't a fault of the car that caused that, something like his car. And I think he'll be able to rebuild off the back of it. A couple of contusions, but no broken bones. I think it's yeah, it's rough for Behrman to come away from that. And I think a lot of people on the surface of it will go, oh, Haas walked away from where they've previously been finishing sort of P5, P6, finishing just scraping their way into P10. But this is one weekend out of three out of a possible 22. So again, Ocon's looking more settled. He's got his feet under the table. It does take him a bit more time to get settled with new regulations and new cars. So it's worth bearing that in mind. He will really enjoy having this 5 week break where he can spend a lot of time on the sim. They'll have a lot of very accurate data on how to set up that sim. They'll have both of the drivers available for 5 weeks to essentially get that sim feeling exactly like how the car felt at three very different circuits, one very high speed, one very technical, one street circuit. They've got two drivers that can now go, yes, the sim now feels exactly like how the car felt around these circuits. You can then more accurately extrapolate that to the rest of the circuits through the year. You can better plan for those weekends. And I think that's something that Haas is really going to enjoy having, because they don't have the huge technical facilities of the other teams, but they can rely on that sort of electronic data that they can more accurately now extrapolate forwards. So there's a lot to build on. I think they'll be grateful having 5 weeks to build on it. They'll be silly if they just sit there and do nothing until Miami. But if they're very clever about this, they've got a chance to really keep their foot on the throttle, keep the pressure on Alpine, because they're in a race for fifth, possibly fourth this year, and that would be one of their strongest results ever in just over 10 years in the sport.
And to expand on what Martin was saying earlier, with positive momentum and mindset, Behrman's seventh overall in the standings now, just with the McLaren drivers having overtaken him. But you've got to look at, again, just the first of races, but the races we've had so far. If McLaren keep having their sort of yo-yo season of when we start, we're good, but we're not always starting or we're not always finishing, Haas could somehow legitimately be fighting McLaren for that place in the constructor standings. He's also just 2 points ahead of Gasly, and Gasly seems to be a one-man band at the moment. We'll get to him in a bit. But that's quite a fun tussle with them to be in to essentially say we're best of the rest, and we're also not a million miles away from McLaren. Let's see how long that lasts. But that's just a very reassuring, positive mindset to be in for a team like Haas, for a team like Alpine. So that's got to give you some good energy going back to the factory in this spring break. Ocon got close to the points in Australia, didn't quite manage it. China obviously didn't go his way, but he's now off the marks and he's got his first point of the season here, which I think, you look at Audi and Hulkenberg, he's had two races now where he was close to being in the points, but Ocon's showing that he is now also doing what we always ask of those teams, which is you've got to be in that position to capitalize if something goes wrong with the teams that you just can't catch up ahead. And Behrman probably wasn't going to get points this weekend because he was just having one of those awkward weekends before the crash even happened. So for Ocon to make up for it and get at least 1 point, that could make the difference come the end of the season. We don't know. So it's still a positive weekend for them. And crucially, the Godzilla livery looked especially excellent.
Mm. The reliability thing's interesting because obviously we don't know how well that HPP setup's going to run. But one of the things we did learn from the relatively closed door testing was the fact that Ferrari seemed to do most of their testing on one engine per chassis. And that's a really positive sign that Ferrari, while it might not be the most sort of outwardly powerful and potent unit there, it does have a certain longevity to it, which means that teams won't be blowing through resources. They won't be blowing through weekends where they just don't get to run because the engine's out. And I think that Behrman just consistently scoring P7, P6, P5, somewhere in that region, possibly P4, maybe the odd podium, is going to be a far better run for the team at a championship than the likes of what we're seeing with Alpine, which may start to fluctuate, and certainly with McLaren, where they've already suffered with those reliability issues. You have it on the face of it, it's not so much of an exciting season if you're just consistently scoring in that points band. But if you're consistently scoring in that points band, it keeps you in the fight a lot better than McLaren, say, going with P2 and P3. We didn't even make the race start. With P3 and P4, we didn't even make the race start. And that constant flip flop. And again, for the rest of the team, it's so much easier to build that sort of regularity. Plus, Jack Doohan is a dab hand when it comes to sim work. Look at the work he did with Alpine. The fact that towards the end of the season where he was doing a lot of sim driving for Alpine, they were able to extract a double podium finish in Brazil. He is a very talented development driver and one I think Haas will enjoy having sort of essentially 5 weeks to go, right, we're chaining you to this sim rig, off you go, sunshine. And hopefully it's going to prove a really powerful asset to them. And I think one that Alpine might regret getting rid of.
Absolutely. I think that it's to go slightly off piece for a moment. There's a lot of drivers who go up to Formula One and don't quite make the grade. I think there's a lot that Doohan's probably as good as, maybe slightly better than, that maybe get 2 or 3 years. And so I think it's a really smart pickup for Haas to get, okay, maybe not one of the best 22 drivers in the world, but certainly, or in F1 in Europe, in the European single seaters, not in IndyCar or WEC or whatever. He's certainly pretty close to that level, and he's proven that in F3, F2. And I think he's got that really good level. I think he's part of a team that is really performing strongly at the moment. And Ayo Komatsu, as you were saying earlier, is really extracting that potential. I think it is most evident this weekend from Esteban Ocon's side in that we know he's potentially not in great form. We know he's not had the best start to the season, at least compared to Ollie Behrman, but we know he is a driver of immense quality. To finish 10th, okay. Would he have liked to finish slightly higher? Sure, but he's off the mark. To have both Ocon and Behrman at some point soon, hopefully for Haas, competing in that seventh, eighth region, starting to pick up 8, 9, 10 points for the team per weekend, that could be absolutely crucial. As you say, it's about competing regularly in that points band with an engine, a power unit that we know is extremely reliable. Just look at the record of the Ferrari engines. I think I'm right in saying that the only retirement has been Bottas with Cadillac in Australia, which although was probably down to power unit failure. That's also a brand new team. If you look at Ferrari, you look at Haas. There's not been a single race day failure. So I think I think it's really good signs from Haas at the moment. The crash, obviously, a pretty tough one to take. But again, there's consolations in it that Behrman was not looking like scoring points. And also, as we keep saying, there's a 5 week break. It's not like there's a race next weekend or in 2 weeks' time, halfway across the world from Japan, where they've suddenly got to source a load more spare parts and make those financial contributions that we know are much harder sometimes for a team like Haas to make. So I think a difficult weekend on Behrman's side for all manner of reasons, but for Ocon, hopefully some quiet optimism, and they can move forward to what is one of their home races next time out.
I think with that Bottas retirement in Australia as well, one of the things that Cadillac did not get right early on was their cooling package and how they sculpted the side pods, how they sculpted the radiator grills. So there is sort of a pinch of salt, a bit of a glimmer of hope for that Ferrari power unit that wasn't something innate to the engine that caused that problem. That could have simply been a case of Cadillac put it in a box and didn't let it breathe, and it got a bit too hot in sort of very simplistic terms. So there is still this sort of great hope that they've got this very reliable unit as a base, and I think the Ferrari teams are sort of looking at it going, okay, let's just stay calm here, let's keep the engine breathing cleanly, and let's just take this one step at a time. So one step at a time for 5 weeks from here, there's a nice amount of development, and one that I think certainly Alpine might be pressuring Colapinto into a lot of work over the next 5 weeks. Gasly qualified seventh, finished seventh, bit of a sort of season regular at this point in the points, whereas Colapinto qualified 15th and finished 16th, which isn't particularly strong. But yeah, it's not even like your drivers ahead of him retiring or anything that could have sort of supplemented that. He just doesn't have the pace on him at the moment. But yeah, Gasly ruthlessly regular this season, a bit like Ollie Behrman, where he's just consistently in the points, consistently just stretching that chassis to exactly what it can do and getting really strong results. Franco, though, looks a little lost and clearly not quite getting to grips with power managing in the same way that the other drivers are. We would look at how the others are deploying power, saving it for a lap, knowing where they can recharge, knowing where they can essentially make these huge passes because they can trust the brakes in the engine, are doing this sort of heavy recuperation. The car isn't terrible. Gasly's getting a lot from it. And ultimately, he's not a particularly highly regarded driver in the best of times. We've sort of seen him compared to the likes of Ocon. We've seen him compared to the likes of Verstappen and Sainz at various different Red Bull teams and the likes of Yuki Tsunoda. But yeah, Gasly's getting a hell of a lot from this chassis, and you would expect that sort of Alpine's golden bullet when it came to sort of trying to steer the ship correctly last year, Franco Colapinto, is sort of the difference is getting a bit stark there, and he's sinking.
Gasly is also the only driver outside of the top four to score points in all of the Grand Prix so far this season, which is a weird thing to say when you consider Alpine from the last couple of years. Um, Also, the fact that they are just quicker than, Red Bull is something that wasn't on anyone's bingo card, quite frankly, for the year. So it's just a very odd situation to contemplate. You look at how we've essentially just had a very small mix-up at the front with Mercedes are back at the front. It's 2014-esque, and you go, okay, we've not had as much of a shake-up as we would like. But then you look at Alpine being there, or at least one of the Alpines, and you kind of go away going, hmm, I'm not quite sure what to make of that because it's just such a massive turnaround, but it's only one half of the garage. Normally, when you see that sort of a turnaround, it's both drivers. So Colapinto, I questioned, as I think many of us did, the switch with doing last year after such a short time for doing at the team, and he's not really done anything to warrant that seat in terms of performance. It took him over nearly a full calendar year to get a first point of the year, and again, a lot of that was because the McLaren simply didn't start the race in China, and there were other things going on in that Grand Prix to help propel him up the order. So, where you have a race that's potentially more representative of what we're going to have later on in the season when teams and drivers figure their stuff out, you can see which driver is there regardless, and you can see which driver isn't. And as I'm sure we'll talk about briefly, Flavio isn't exactly soft kitten when it comes to how he treats his drivers and what he wants performance-wise from them. With Gasly, though, it's going to be interesting to see what happens with him in the future. You'd argue he's had the majority of his F1 career so far. He's in what I'm going to call Sergio Perez territory of unless a seat at the top somewhere opens up, he's not going to be around for a lot longer simply because you're going to have drivers from F2 and F3 coming along that will just simply be worth taking a punt on more than the consistency of a stable pair of hands. But if, as we'll get to, Verstappen decides he's had enough, you've got a potential opening at Red Bull and a very different Red Bull from the one that he was at previously. So would that be tempting for him if they improve enough, but just not enough of Verstappen to want to stay? Would Gasly be tempted? Because I can't see any of the other teams at the top opening up a seat for them unless something calamitous happens.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question because I think what he's shown, as you say, over the last few years is that, okay, he might not be able to produce amazing results, but to be frank, that Alpine hasn't been producing amazing results with a couple of very minor exceptions for quite a long time. I think to get 15 points out of 3 races, if you'd have offered that to any driver outside of maybe those top 4 teams before the start of the season, they'd have probably snapped your hand off. And it tells you something that Ollie Behrman has got more than that. I think with Gasly, it's a case of how long can he maintain this for? 10th, 6th, and 7th first 3 races is outstanding. It's just whether this is just 3 races or whether this is the true pace of the Alpine, as it certainly looks like it is. As we say for Franco Colapinto, it's starting to get slightly worrying in terms of that pace gap. It was really evident this weekend, and it almost reminded me a little bit of Gasly's own situations and the situations of plenty of other Red Bull drivers alongside Max Verstappen, except we know that as good a driver, as consistent a driver as Pierre Gasly is, he's, despite what we saw this weekend, probably not on the level of Max Verstappen. So I think for Franco, it's a case of the 5 week break can be a good time. He's really got to find something in the next few Grand Prix. The saving grace, as we know, will be that he does bring a decent amount of funding to that team at a time when they're looking for more external investment anyway. So I think he'll probably have a longer stay of execution than Doohan did if these results continue. But I certainly think that if you're this far off the pace of your teammate in a car that is clearly competitive, it's not like Colapinto's 19th and Gasly's 13th and they're both outside the points. And with respect, it doesn't matter as much. When there's the opportunity to get both cars in the points regularly, you can see why Flavio Briatore, with his history, may move at some point soon. And then you think, well, who could come in? Well, Alpine have just signed Alex Dunn to their academy, and with some of the performances he put in F2 last season, you would think he's a pretty good fit for a Flavio Briatore team in terms of his uh, pace and his aggression at the wheel. So I certainly think that while Franco Colapinto will have a few more races, he's going to be looking over his shoulder if this continues much longer.
Yeah, there's going to be a couple of uncomfortable dinners at Flavio Briatore's very gaudily decorated house over the next 5 weeks for Franco Colapinto, and I can't imagine they're
I
going
don't
to.
know if there's ever such a thing as a comfortable dinner with that kind of decor, but I know what you
Yeah.
mean.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting one. I think Franco's going to have to prove a lot, but you're definitely right. He's got that extended stay of execution purely on the financial side. He's got some huge sponsors behind him, national banks from sort of across Southern America, lots of sort of really big. I think he's also. I think I'm right in saying he's possibly got like the Argentine Postal Service also sponsoring him. There's all sorts of sort of huge backers that are going to keep him in that seat. But if you're the likes of Alex Dunn or more prevalently Paul Aron, I would be sort of putting together my biggest list of sponsors available and going, what do you think? Especially considering Paul Aron has done a lot of FP1 sessions. He will likely be doing a lot of sim work for the team at the moment. If anyone's got an understanding of what that car's like to drive outside of Colapinto and Gasly, it's likely going to be Paul Aron. So potentially this is the chance he gets at that seat. And while it seems rough, it seems callous and uncalled for. sometimes that's the only way you end up with your seat, and you have to sit there sort of wishing for the downfall of another. But we'll see how it
That's
goes. Not
essentially
like,
how Colapinto got his seat in the first
yeah,
place.
it's not like Colapinto's not had a fair crack at the whip. Obviously, he had that half a season at
More
Williams.
more of it than Doohan did.
Yeah, he had that half a season at Williams when he replaced Logan Sargent, sort of suddenly coming out of the summer break, and then he's had almost a full season at Alpine, give or take a couple of races. So he's had his chance. He's shown us what he can do, and unfortunately, in a car that looks like it's now going to be regularly scoring a fairly decent points haul each weekend, he's not able to get close to that. And previously, we've sort of gone, yeah, fair's fair when Red Bull have done it, but I don't see why we should be quite so critical when Briatore does it this time. When the
Like
cars,
Martin says, it's
yeah,
this whole thing of if you're fighting for 13th and 18th, it doesn't really matter as much. And Alpine do have the equivalent of that. But when the opportunity comes to be fourth or fifth or sixth, at top end of the midfield, if you lose by anywhere between 10 points or less, and you have that second driver who just wasn't performing, it's like you can't really blame Gasly for that at that point because the guy's doing his damn best and could just do with a bit of help.
yeah, and again, Gasly wouldn't say no to having a second driver up there, sort of wingmanning for him. And if you look at the way that sort of the Ferrari guys, Mercedes guys, the McLaren guys have been running their season, they've had sort of two hands in this fight. And previously, it's taken the likes of a Max Verstappen to really dominate with one hand tied behind your back because you don't have a teammate who can match you. And I don't think Gasly's quite at that Max Verstappen level. Speaking of that Max Verstappen level, he wasn't quite on it this weekend. Usually a bit of a circuit specialist when it comes to Suzuka, qualifies 11th, doesn't make it through to Q3, does go on to finish P8, making up a few of those lost places. Hajar, meanwhile, qualifies 8th and drops backwards to finish 12th. So, yeah, uncomfortable time.
First time I believe Verstappen's not qualified either on pole or outside the top 10 since about 2019 or something silly. And I know we didn't go there for a couple of years, but at the same time, ridiculous.
Yeah, I think just even sort of, yeah, I think certainly for Suzuka, possibly I want to say like 2017, maybe as far back as that. So we've got a good run of sort of Verstappen knowing this circuit and then all of a sudden going,
Difference 12 months makes when he dominates at a circuit last year where he didn't think he was going to win a Grand Prix. We didn't quite believe him at that point. But he certainly wasn't expecting it. And McLaren being in the dominant form that they were to go 12 months later to go, you're just going to get scraped inside the top 10 in the race. But that Alpine you're lapping last year is going to be ahead of you on pace. Just yeah, he's going to be another one. We keep talking about spring break, 5 weeks. He's going to need the 5 weeks to think about what the heck happened there.
yeah, it's very odd. And I don't think it's helped by the fact that Hajar was able to get one lap pace out of it, but can't find Grand Prix pace in that chassis either. It's very tricky to learn by the look of things, and that's tricky to learn by Max Verstappen standards. And yeah, it's unable to compete on long-term pace with the Mercedes, the McLaren, and the Ferrari, and it seems to struggle with the one lap pace against the likes of an Alpine and a Haas. So it's sort of comfortably the fourth, fifth, maybe even sixth fastest car, depending on the day, the weather conditions. That's averaging it between the two drivers as well. I think that puts a lot of effort into Max really being able to string 110% out of a car that can maybe only ever give 70%. And yeah, Hajar moaning a lot this weekend, by and large, outpaced on the Sunday as well by the junior team. When you look at what the likes of certainly Liam Lawson was able to extract from the sort of 90% car.
It's also the first time we've seen both Red Bulls finish a Grand Prix this season.
Yes, which is odd to say as well.
I think that's the other side of it for Red Bull is at the moment we're still thinking about them as this all-conquering multi-championship winning operation that they were, I guess, slightly more briefly in more recent years, but also 15 years ago as well. And we're still thinking, well, that potential is surely there. And it absolutely is. But they're currently in, and it's often forgotten, a brand new partnership between their own new engine department and Ford, who haven't been in F1 for a number of decades. There's a hell of a lot of learning going on there for the team and for the drivers with the new strategies that they're going to be dealing with. And what I would say is that while Max's distaste for the new cars can't be helping his current form, even if some of his concerns were well founded, the bigger consequence for me is it's going to be destabilizing for the team. If you're a Red Bull employee and you've been used to um, fighting for wins, fighting for championships 95% of the time with one driver in Max Verstappen for the last 8 years, and then suddenly you see a news report from a very reputable Dutch journalist on Sunday saying Max Verstappen may retire from F1. And then you think if you're at Red Bull, well, okay, so we've got Isak, who's clearly a quality driver, but we don't know if he's Max's level. Arvid's clearly a quality driver, but he's very, very young. Liam Lawson is a good driver. Okay, there's some good juniors, but if Max Verstappen leaves Red Bull, suddenly that's the heart, the soul that the team has been built around for the last decade gone. And I'm not saying he's going to leave, but when someone starts making that threat, when someone's so fundamental to the team, more fundamental than Christian Horner, as was proven, is starting to make those threats that they're going to leave the team, retire from the sport, move to GTs, whatever it is, that really can't be helping a team that is already struggling. We know that there is some kind of pace in the Red Bull because Isaac Hadjar qualified third in Melbourne. So there is something there, but how much is there, we really don't know because there's such an inconsistency. I'd be quite interested to see how they do in Miami, given that with it being a street track, a few medium to high speed corners, it's a little bit similar to Melbourne and some low speed chicanes as well. I'd be interested to see how that works with that team, but it's still a really tricky situation for Red Bull right now.
You have the element as well of if Verstappen did leave, whoever fits in that into his seat essentially, regardless of if it would be Lawson getting the promotion back into Red Bull, or if we see a cage fight between Gasly and Perez to try and get back into Red Bull because they don't want to be stuck where they are. None of them are Max Verstappen. None of them are that level of driver. You'd need to try and poach someone like Alonso at the earlier, or the minimum rather, to have that sort of confidence returned to you from the team, like you say, with your average Red Bull employee, to see, okay, we are now capable of this rather than this is still going to take a while because they're good drivers, but they might not be great, and they're still capable of the greatness, but we're not going to get there overnight. We don't have an Antonelli, we don't have a Lewis. Do we get Alonso for a year while we wait for someone else to become available? And if we don't, how is that going to impact the retention rates of those employees and try and get some new people in there, and it completes this sort of rebirth that Red Bull are going through.
And yeah, you need someone who can come in and be a team leader as well. You don't just need a quick car. You need, this is the thing with Max being very pessimistic and sort of annoyed and grumbly at the moment, is because he is that team leader, because he is that person that everyone looks to for sort of a steer on what the team's doing at the moment. You need someone that can also command that same presence. And if you look at what the team has been able to achieve in those past few years, it's because there's been this sort of very strong focus that Max Verstappen has drawn onto himself as well as had thrust onto himself. And I don't think you could put that sort of pressure structure onto the likes of Liam Lawson, onto Isaac Hadjar. You end up with that sort of very nebulous sort of world that we had when it was the two Daniels in the team, Ricardo and Kvyat, because neither of them was a bad driver per se, but they weren't able to be a focal point of the team, be able to sort of motivate the team around them. And this was a team that still had a very sort of driven Christian Horner to it. It still had a young, sort of motivated, switched on, aware of what was going on in a very his form of racing, Helmut Marko as well. That was a very different world, and they didn't need that sort of person. But now more than ever, now that they've got Laurent Mekies at the, so they've got, yeah, is it Mekies at the top? Yeah, it is Mekies. I've lost track of who's at the Red Bull. Laurent Mekies at the top of Red Bull. They need sort of someone who's very technically astute and someone who can manage a team, but you need someone who is the figure point for a team as well. And I don't think that you can find that without Verstappen. But at the same time, if he wants to make that call, that's entirely on him. There's no point in him racing in a series that he's not enjoying, getting anything from. Essentially, you wouldn't go and do a job that you find boring and uninteresting it doesn't it functionally it's a bit of a weird analogy to make because everyone goes, yeah, but his job is Formula One, but he's used to a certain level of racing, used to this idea of being able to battle, of being able to go wheel to wheel. Yes, GT and sports car has sort of balance of performance and all that sort of thing, but and as he found out, some stringent regulations. But what racing doesn't these days, we don't have Can-Am where you can just go and drive something with an 8.2 litre V8 in it and radiators hidden away in its wings. That doesn't exist. You can't have unregulated racing these days. But Max is smart enough to know that as well. He wants something where there is this very much idea of balanced performance. So therefore, the emphasis on what you can achieve as a driver. And at the moment, the cars are not built to showcase what you can do as a driver. We have that super clipping, which means that you're no longer approaching corners at the absolute limit of what a chassis can take. You're approaching it at the absolute limit of how much battery charge you need to harvest. That's the difference. We're no longer seeing cars that look twitchy and on the edge. They're twitching on the edge on corner exit because that's when they're deploying the full 1,000 horsepower. That's no different to before, but it's no longer twitching on the edge on corner entry because the entry speeds are so much lower, because the cars are arriving at these points going so much slower. We're not getting that exciting racing. We're not getting that ability to make those sort of interesting passes or try and be the last of the late breakers. You can't do that when your car is already braking for you. And that's what Max Verstappen seems to find so uncomfortable. It's not his style of racing where he has full control over when the car starts to retard against essentially its acceleration. That's that's not Max Verstappen. So I don't want to sort of justify him being grouchy and sort of being a bit toddlerish and throwing his toys out the pram. But at the same time, you can see why he's not happy with the way things are going. The chassis is terrible. It does not respond to what he wants. The powertrain is essentially working completely against him. And the style of racing that the sport now demands of him is an antithesis to what he's after. He might even look at IndyCar, where if you get, again, going back to Alabama, the amount of times that we saw those cars on the limits of traction and limits of what those chassis could do, where it came down to the experience of drivers being able to cling on to them. That's why Alex Palou made it work, because he was able to make that chassis and make a constant series of sets of used hard tires work for him across the weekend, because it's about what you as a driver can extract from those chassis. That's what Max Verstappen races for. And I think that's why he's getting grumpy with this, is because you can't take the chassis to 100% of what it's able to do at the moment, because you never get to a corner at 100% of the speed you should be able to take it at.
I absolutely agree with you. I think it's a really interesting balance that the FIA is going to have to find when it inevitably revises these regulations, which I know there's going to be meetings going on between now and Miami. There will be some changes. I don't think they're going to be fundamental because I think that the investments made both by Formula One, the FIA, but also by these manufacturers that have come in into these 50/50 power units, those investments are too large for them to be just chucked away, fortunately or unfortunately. I do think these regulations have their merits. I think it's not always spoken about enough because some of the downsides are so obvious, and I completely agree on the downsides. Watching a qualifying lap has been pretty painful in particular. I think that the racing is clearly better. I think the aerodynamics are superb. I think that, okay, even if we do have artificial passing in inverted commas, I would much prefer to have, I know in Australia, I think it was something like three times the number of passes, perhaps. I'll have to check that. Three times the number of passes in a race. Yes, okay, they were artificial, but I prefer that to have what we had in Suzuka last year, which was five or six drivers outside the top 10 who couldn't get past each other because they all had DRS and they were all just stuck, and they actually might as well have finished 30 laps early because nothing was going to change. So I think that needs to be applauded. I think there needs to be ways made to show that that is what F1 can be, but that there also needs to be a balance between neutering that idea of the super clipping, the idea that actually drivers aren't on the limit. There's straights that we're almost that we're lifting on that we really shouldn't be lifting on. That are some of the most famous corners in Formula One. You look at the Casio Triangle this weekend. Okay, there was a lot of speed through 130R, but even then there was a lot of lifting off afterwards. And I think even outside of the safety aspect, which is a whole different conversation, there needs to be some kind of balance found. So I can see why it's a difficult one for the FIA because I can and the F1 and the teams, because I can see some of the fruits of what they've all been working on over the last few years. I can see what they're aiming for, but the execution hasn't been quite right. I've got confidence both in the practicalities of it, in that there's ways of increasing, as we saw at Suzuka in itself, there's ways of increasing energy recovery allowances and these things. I just think that um, there's there's a balance that needs to be struck in that sense.
Yeah, I think there'll be a tipping point for it. And I think, yeah, the racing in and of itself, the actual sort of wheel to wheel, when we see cars able now, because they're lighter, smaller, the aerodynamics are cleaner, go side by side and sort of jostle it out. And again, like you, I don't mind the weirdly artificial passes. I think it's artificial because we've not seen overtaking like this in quite some time. So it looks almost faked
Exactly.
human.
Exactly. I watched F1 for 16 years and I've never seen this amount of overtaking, because and it has that almost jarring effect, because it almost looks like it's too easy, but actually, as I say, I'd much prefer that.
Hmm. And that I enjoy, but again, I think when we get to the likes of, I think Spa is going to be a huge eye-opener for the FIA when they go, wait, hang on. When you look at some of the sectors of Spa where you have drivers tipping cars in, sort of previously full throttle, and you heard, I think it might have been the 2020 Mercedes has one of the best qualifying laps around that circuit that you will ever see, because you see how dynamic that car is having to be on the circuit, how it's using its tires, how it's using its aerodynamic load, its suspension, how it's requiring Lewis Hamilton to take that car to the absolute physical limits of what is possible within those regulations. And you watch him sort of tip it in through the likes of Pouillon route the back section of that circuit where it's those huge high speed bends. That's what Formula One is. And if you want a really good lap round there, go watch the Porsche 919 Evo lap round there. It's phenomenal, mind blowing, sort of physics warping. But the fact of the matter is, that's what you watch Formula One for, is how far can you take the idea of just simple tire versus tarmac grip. At the moment, because of the super clipping, we're not seeing that. Other aspects, brilliant. But I think Spa, Silverstone as well is going to be a really interesting one. A qualifying lap round Silverstone is an absolute roller coaster ride, because you get to the end of the national pit straight, you get to Copse, and in previous modern Formula One cars, that's barely even a lift to get the front end to rotate in. I think they're going to be like sort of stamping on the throttle, trying to get it to kick down in like an old automatic American slush box, trying to find some speed to get it through that turn. Maggots Beckett's, if you watch it from, what is it, the other end of Maggots Beckett's is Chapel, isn't it? If you watch it from there, you have the cars actively darting through there. You can see the back end trying to break loose. We're not going to see that because through Maggots Beckett's, the cars aren't going to be entering that section quickly, and they probably won't be exiting it particularly quickly either. It's going to change hugely how dynamic these cars are. And you go and watch another motor racing series, and it's hugely exposed. Again, I don't want to keep going back to Atlanta, but it's a brilliant circuit for how much it puts those cars through. It was great when we got to the end of that race and you saw Alex Palou pull off the racing line down the start finish straight, just how many tire marbles were gathered essentially off the racing line, which shows the huge amounts of load and energy being put through the tires across one race. We're not seeing marbles building up a lot at the moment in Formula One. You do the pickup at the end of the Grand Prix, but not to the same. We're just not seeing that degradation build up. And yeah, we've got harder tires from Pirelli. We're not seeing that build up, but you get the marbles build up because you're using up the tire, you're scrubbing it across the surface, you're putting that load through it. At the moment, we just aren't. And I think that's one of
It
the other things.
it almost goes back to um, I know we need to discuss racing balls, but it almost goes back to a fundamental sporting argument in terms of when you're watching a 100-meter sprint at the Olympics, or when you're watching, the long jump, you're watching athletes that are on the physical limit of what is possible. And in Formula One, we are theoretically watching an athlete and a machine working together to break that limit and go beyond the limit of what we think is possible. That's what we're all watching for, right? And I think when that sparkle, that illusion almost is broken, and you can see you go on board and you can hear there's not that constant whir of the throttle, and it sounds almost unbelievable because we're not at that level that we're so used to. It's almost like sometimes, oh well, what are we doing this for? Should we not pack up and go home? Because it's okay, it's the pinnacle of racing still, but how is this possible that we are spending so much time not actually accelerating and going forward? Um, Silverstone and Spa, as you say, are not going to be good if nothing changes. On the other hand, Singapore could be one of the best Singapore Grand Prix we've had for a long time because there's lots of opportunity to recharge and there are still some decent length straights. So if they can find that balance, as we say, we might get somewhere, but that's going to be a very, very tough thing for them to do.
It's going to be a big hurdle to overcome. But anyway, we've sort of gotten a bit waylaid with sort of the hurdles of racing because, again, 3 races into a very new set of technical regulations, one of the biggest overhauls we've seen in the sport's history for quite some time. Racing Bulls, then. Hanging on to the coattails of their bigger sibling, Lawson qualifies 14th, finishes 9th. A great recovery drive from him. Meanwhile, Lindblad edges his way into the top 10 in qualifying and finishes 14th. Still a lot to learn for Arvid. Looks strong though, but yeah, points for Liam, really good. It's a mixed pace in the car. Arvid's first visit to the track, so a lot to learn. Not bad. A bit of a quiet one for them, really.
It wouldn't be a massive surprise if they beat Red Bull by the end of the season. I think this is the first year, possibly ever, where we can legitimately consider that without being accused of having sniffed something beforehand. Lawson's just 2 points away from Verstappen in the championship, and it's on merit. He's the second best Red Bull affiliated driver at the moment, and Lindblad's not too far behind. He's a sensible, calm figure. And okay, he didn't get a point this weekend, but he knocked Max Verstappen out of getting a chance to be in Q3. Again, on merit, it's not too bad. And he's also proven that he's a fighter. He's not going to take anything lying down, regardless of who it is. You saw that in Australia with Verstappen. You saw that here with Hadjar. He's not shy. He's going to get his elbows out. And I like that because we're just not used to that with those kind of racing bull Toro drivers. We saw that a bit with Lawson, famously with Perez, and we thought, oh, that's kind of refreshing and nice because, yeah, okay, there's a bit of a gentleman's agreement there, more between these two teams than the others, but that is, should only last so long. Whereas now we've got two drivers like that, and at a moment in time where you might as well try and make hay while the sun shines because, from the driver standpoint alone, you look so much better if you somehow manage to outperform the quote unquote top team and the top drivers. And if you can beat Verstappen, maybe not over the course of a season, but if you can consistently beat him and be only a handful of points away from him by the end of the season, bad for him, great for you and your availability to either replace him or if we get some random silly season driver moves at the top, to put yourself up for grabs for one of those teams and go, fair enough, if that's what you can do in that, I wonder what you could do here. I do also now kind of want to see Lawson versus Lindblad at some point because that could be some real fireworks level stuff. And we've never really seen them race together. I was thinking about this, and Martin, you might know if we have seen them, but they were just, I think, just missing each other when they were coming through the junior ranks. There was always just one was leaving as the other one was entering, and we haven't really seen it. So if we don't get that at least once this year, I'm going to be gutted because I kind of trust them to behave, but that could also be a right mess, and I'm kind of here for both.
I think it's really interesting that that dynamic between them. It almost it almost makes me feel we're talking about Antonelli second season going for the championship earlier. It's 2008 again. We've got in that second Red Bull team, in the Racing Bulls, we've got a rookie and a guy who we know is pretty solid. He's been around for a couple of years. Limel, of course, I should say, rookie in his first full season, like Sebastian Vettel was. I would be very, very interested to see that battle, see who would come out on top, especially considering, as you say, they have shown pretty similar levels this season. Lindblad, I think, lost out in the with the safety car, but he was running in the top 10 earlier in the race, and I think both drivers have shown that this season is going to be a really competitive one for Racing Bulls, especially when okay they occupy the positions between those two Red Bull drivers, and that Racing Bulls, as we say, is on on par with the Red Bull at the moment. I would still be a little surprised if they came out and beat Red Bull over the course of the season, just because the machinery at that top team is theoretically so good. But hey, Toro Rosso won a race in 2008 when Red Bull didn't. So it's very much not impossible that they get some really standout results this season, especially with the uh, variation in reliability that we all know exists.
Toro Rosso won in 2020 when Red Bull were also competitive and winning races. So you've got that other side of it as well going, yeah, you can do it,
Very
but
good
we
point.
can do it on occasion as well. So we're not going to gift it to you just because we're going to take the chances where they come because what you were saying before when we were talking about all of the new releases and everything, if we're not going for it on some level, then what the hell are we doing here? We're not here to just be nice. We're here to win. I don't care if you're the big brother, the big sister team. Got to take the chances where they come because if we look what that could have done potentially for Gasly's career. Okay, it didn't work out the way you wanted it to, but you can't say that winning ones are hindered him.
Yeah, it's an interesting time, I think, for Racing Bulls, and I don't think they'll beat out Red Bull across the course of a season. I think Max Verstappen is too much of a force to be reckoned with. While he grumbles a lot outside the car and makes life difficult for certain journalists, when he gets in the car, he does give it 110% every time. You can't fault him for that. And I think that will shine through on the points board at the end of the season. But I think it's going to be a closer run thing than anyone at Milton Keynes is happy for it to be.
Suppose it will just come down to that mentality again of yeah, you've got Verstappen 110%, but nothing left to prove in F1 versus two very hungry drivers who want everything that he has and more, and have more of a risk factor to take to go even more ball to the wall than is strictly necessary. And the both drivers, you would say, are more than capable of that sort of I don't want to say recklessness, but recklessness.
And there's nothing that's going to motivate those guys at Racing Bulls more than the opportunity to beat those guys over the road that are meant to be better than them.
There is a strong sense of competition between the two sides. Again, sort of knowing a few people who work in that factory, I know that there is a sense of rivalry between the two, and it is a case of yeah, you might be the bigger team, but certainly this season alone, we're keeping you honest. And I think that's going to be really interesting to watch as the season goes by. Meanwhile, somehow hot against all sort of previous advice, hot on the tails of the two Red Bull teams. Audi, Hulkenberg qualified 13th, finishes 11th this time out. Meanwhile, Bortoleto scrapes his way into Q3 and bags a tidy Q9 and finishes 13th. Yeah, following the odd news of Wheatley's departure, the team remains relatively unshaken and still about where we expect to see them. This is sort of what Team and I always refer to as sort of the golden sniping zone, just sort of where you need to be for picking up bits when something goes wrong for someone else. And yeah, not to be this weekend. Gabby's lap pace is still stellar. The car just can't support him over a Grand Prix. I think this is also the region of this sort of review where we get a bit quicker with things because not a great deal going on here.
Think this is a team where they're just, and we've said this in the last two Grand Prix reviews as well, but they're quietly going about their business and where they're obviously not where they want to be. All things considered, they're pretty respectable right now. You know, it's not just a slapping an Audi badge on a Sauber. There's a whole new power unit, a whole new bunch of technical governance going into this as a result of just Audi replacing Sauber, never mind the new regulations. And so for them to be ahead of Cadillac is not surprising, but for them to be ahead of Williams and Aston Martin, if you told us that this time last year, we'd be very intrigued as to how that happened. And they're not really telling us. They're just kind of, like I say, quietly going about their business. The only criticism I had for them this weekend was hitting Hulkenberg that late into the safety car period because it didn't really seem to do anything. And that was just a bit odd. But again, aside from if that's the one thing I'm criticizing you for over the weekend, you're probably not doing too badly for such a powerful outfit that has a lot more potential than the last three teams at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I think it's maybe a tough one for them to not pick up points, especially for Hulkenberg coming 11th for two races in a row, which has happened in his career before. But I think it's I think it's still, as we say, a respectable weekend. Certainly not a bad weekend considering the very recent context of Jonathan Wheatley leaving suddenly, having seemingly been absolutely all in on this project, and Matteo Binotto coming in to replace him, even if he was already at the team in another capacity. If one driver in front, as we say, had retired with a mechanical issue, as we might have expected, then they would have had something tangible to show for their efforts. But I still think 11th and 13th is a fairly good showing for them, even if they haven't yet added to their tally for a couple of weekends. It's also the first race day in which they've not had a retirement, which for a team that has constructed a brand new engine from scratch should be considered a win in itself, I think.
Yeah, it's a strong go for Audi really, and I think they're exactly where they want to be at the moment as well. And again, they'll be using this sort of spring break as such to sort of take stock and go, okay, we're in an interesting place. Yeah, that safety car period misstep though, bear in mind we've got Binotto back at the top of a team at the moment. So
I did immediately think that when they pitted him. I thought, why have you done? Oh, yeah, never mind. I
yeah,
know exactly why this happened.
this immediately
I'll
checks
get
out.
back in the box. I know what happened.
Yeah, figured that one out quite quickly. But regardless, it's going to be an interesting time watching Audi as they move forwards from here. And yeah, I maybe
They're a
Aston
team with
Martin.
two drivers, which
Yeah,
none of the teams ahead of them before you get to the likes of McLaren, Mercedes, Ferrari have, if you want to make that argument. Haas, principally Behrman, Alpine, principally Gasly. Racing Bulls maybe is the only team that has two, but you've got one of them as a rookie, whereas Audi have an experienced rookie now in Bortoleto. So you've got, and they're beating these teams, at least one of the drivers. Okay, in Haas's case, Behrman did crash, but you take what you take. So you've got these two drivers who are more than capable of it, and so you're not fighting with one hand behind your back necessarily. That seems a bit unnecessarily harsh on Hadjar, but at the moment, the evidence backs it up.
yeah, it's an interesting state of affairs. I think they're possibly well suited to sort of a mid-season run for the top end of the championship. Certainly not a win, but they might be sort of getting up there to start putting the pressure on.
P3 and Silverstone for Mr. Hulkenberg wouldn't be something we would complain about.
Hmm. They'll be in a position, I think, somewhere towards the end of the season to be able to put pressure on the likes of Alpine and maybe Haas. Possibly we were wrong at the start of the season when we said it was going to be an all-out American battle between Haas and Cadillac, and we completely forgot to factor the fact that Audi are realistically a new team and are going to be the ones that look like it on the face of things to be up there challenging. Certainly replacing Williams for being that regular point scorer at the bottom end like they were last season. Williams, at the meantime, though, Sainz qualified 16th, finished 15th. Albon qualified 17th, finished 20th. Not really sure what Albon passed through this weekend when it comes to sort of strange levels of hell, all sorts of various pit stops and sort of just seemingly sort of
They
not
were
actually
just using
any
it as a
car.
test session towards the end of the Grand Prix. They kind of admitted as much on the radio, I think. And yeah, it says a lot about the team essentially that you kind of give up halfway through the race and go, right, we're just going to do this, this, and this. And you think, no, the transponder's having a bit of fun. No, they're genuinely outpitting him every single lap just to try various different things out, which not where you want them to be. And again, it's so odd because Vowles has put so much time and effort into this regulation set. He's talked about it for so long, and yet this is what he's got to show for it so far. It's not Aston Martin levels of that, but it's a weird competition between the two that's happening.
I find it really interesting in, as you say there, the level of this discussion and weight that James Vowles has spent the last few years putting on this particular season. The famous quote, not bothered about 23, not bothered about 24, not bothered about 25, bothered about 26. And yet these results are harking back to before his time at the helm. I think I have got faith in Williams to pick it up in terms of he has proven that he can get a team to develop to be a podium finishing team over a number of years before from this kind of position. Doesn't make the situation they're in right now any better. I think it's summed up really by Sainz scraping into Q2, coming 16th, rather than scraping into Q3 or getting well into Q3 as you might have expected from Williams last season and competing for a top five result. And it's especially relevant when you think that Cadillac is a brand new team, Aston Martin is a horror show, to be frank. And actually, that's four spots in Q1 that are locked down. Actually, Sainz has only had to beat two drivers to get out of Q1. He's only just managed to do that, and L1 hasn't. So I think it's very, very, very difficult for Williams at the moment. I have got faith in them to return to where they should be, but in terms of where Vals has said they should be, or at least where they were last season, but I think it's looking very difficult, at least in the short to medium term.
It is mad that the two teams that made such a big deal out of 2026 are Williams and Aston Martin, and you go, okay, you've trained for this all your life. It's almost a comedic remake of Rocky, where he trains for years and years and years and years, gets into the ring, and is just knocked out immediately and is just dead in the ring. And you go, what the hell did we just do here? That was clearly not what that was meant to happen here. So it's, yeah, I hope it's something where they can both turn it around, because you want to see Alonso up there, you want to see the Williams drivers up there. They've both, been sold, especially Sainz, on this plan that Vals has. And okay, three Grand Prix, maybe we get to Miami, maybe we get to after the summer break and they go on an absolute run. But I would like them to be able to do what McLaren did a couple of years ago, where you look at how they started, I think 24 or 23, and then a year or two later they're up there. But it tests the patience a bit as a fan, especially when you're a Williams fan and you've been waiting for this for almost as long as Ferrari have been waiting to get back up the top. At least Ferrari have been able to scrape wins and podiums pretty consistently. Williams haven't been able to manage that really until last year, and then you feel like you're back at square one again, and you go, "Oh, please don't! I don't want to do this again for another how many years?"
Yeah, it's not going to be a fun one if this is the trajectory they're on, and if we're stuck with the same sort of previous very slow learning Williams. Hopefully they learn a lot quicker this season than we've seen them do previously. Obviously, last year and the year before, they started to pick up a lot quicker than we anticipated, but also we're getting to the end of a very well-worn set of regulations. They had a very competent power unit in the car. They still have very good power unit in the car, but we've got a team that just sort of seems to be struggling to find not even the technical aspects of the car. The car seems to handle and drive all right. It's just encumbered by this huge amount of weight, which is a very odd thing for the team to fall short on. And hopefully it's something they're able to rectify moving forwards. Again, they've got 5 weeks to look at things, be running sort of bits and pieces of cars through scales, looking at sort of what can actually be trimmed down, taken out, and sort of worked on, because it's arguably and obviously one of the heaviest cars on the grid. It does not have the sort of lithe agility of the other cars. You see it going through the sectors where the cars are able to run at high speed, and it just doesn't look like it's there. But yeah, I don't have anything to say on Williams that moves the story on. It's the same gripes that I've had for the past two races. Everyone else has unearthed something interesting to say about the sport, the way the team's developed. Williams are just in the hole at the moment, and I'm waiting for them to dig themselves out. Meanwhile, Cadillac, um, kind of a positive one. Bottas qualified 20th, finished 19th. Perez qualified 19th, finished 17th. And they both made it to the end, close to the lead lap. The car is still a long way off the pace, which, when you consider how Haas is doing with the Ferrari power unit, tells you a lot about the chassis, though.
Think it's a little bit like Audi. They're just quietly going about their business, and the fact that they're ahead of Aston Martin, they're in the mix with Williams. I mean, if you said that to us last year, you'd be going, "Hey, I'm very impressed with Cadillac. They're fighting and dicing with Aston Martin and Williams," and you just kind of lose the context of it, and it sounds a lot more impressive. But the fact that they are not bottom and they're just not really having any major issues. You spoke about Bottas in Australia earlier. That's the only real blip they've had. The rest of the time, they've just been slow. But that's fine, because you're not really expecting much anyway. It's a massive operation, but it's year one, day one sort of thing. Yeah, you weren't really going to do a Brawn 2009. It was a nice idea for 5 minutes, but I don't think that was ever going to happen, really. So just quietly go about your business. And I think that's what we've seen from Bottas more than Perez. Perez has been interesting in his comments before, during, and after races, whereas Bottas has just been more the chill Bottas that we've seen of recent years, and I think he knows and understands more of what he signed up for than potentially Perez does, and that will be interesting to watch as the season goes on. But it is, despite being the second to last team on the grid, quite positive in a odd sort of way.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think the team knows that they're going to be plodding around at the back probably for the whole season, but actually that will probably do them quite a lot of good. As you say, they were never going to be fighting up at the front end this weekend in particular, pretty incident free, ahead of Aston Martin, still with Sergio Perez. No retirements. I think it's pretty positive. Yeah, sure. Would they like to be fighting in the top 10? I'm sure they would be, but it's going to take a couple of years at least until that happens. That point there you made about Bottas being um, seeming like this was more what he expected than Perez, I thought was it's an interesting one and something I've picked up as well in terms of Bottas seems to have understood more. This is a very long-term project that he probably, with his age and with someone waiting in Formula 2 with the express purpose of replacing one of them, is not going to be there for a massively long period of time. I'd be intrigued as to see how intense that inter-driver battle is now, considering that they're both at the end of the season. There is not really any hope that they're going to be fighting for points. Maybe they might get a lucky one in a crazy race, but I commits to 2020, but you find it pretty unlikely. And so I'd be interested to see how much both drivers are fighting for that seat in that team next season when we know that as long as Herta performs to a half decent level in F2, he will likely be taking one of those seats.
Yeah, the pressure on I think Bottas and Perez is interesting, and you can tell how they're responding to it on very different levels. And I think it's gonna be telling towards the end of the year whether the sort of calm, relaxed, incredibly zen Bottas just sort of gently lumbers his way into some points, whereas Perez, from a case of over pushing, just doesn't. But again, it depends on who also wants to be in that team moving forwards as well. Perez is a bit older than Bottas. He's obviously got a family that he's going to settle down with at some point. Maybe Perez knows this is his last chance for another sort of year or two at something decent. Realistically, Herta might do a second year in F2 just to really get his feet under the table, used to the style of European circuits and the European calendar. Gives Perez another year. Bottas might know that he's got a year or two on top of that just so someone decent is there to teach her to the reins. It's unlikely they're going to take on two rookies. We've seen teams do that and it never pans out well. So there's more under the surface at Cadillac than I think we can possibly sort of accurately comment on or possibly even give credit for. So it's an interesting one moving forwards, and I look forward to seeing how they develop. But at the moment, they've got a lot of technical developing to do, as well as when it comes to their professional side of things. And that brings us neatly to the end of the constructors list with Aston Martin. Alonso qualifies 21st, finishes 18th. Stroll qualifies 22nd and does not finish the race. Again, with the previous races, I have nothing new to add to the kicking of Aston Martin.
There is progress. Third time of asking, at least one Aston Martin finished the Grand Prix. I was finally proven right for my prediction. You had to have a little bit of faith, and I was rewarded this weekend. Yes, we have to set the bar very low and get it specially ordered, but they got over it. Alonso finished a race. We should be celebrating.
Well done, Fernando. Well done. I guess it's positive in that sense, but it's also it grinds it down even more. There's no other cars sharing this Honda power unit, which we think is not very good. There's no car that's holding fundamental flaws quite like them. It's going to be a long time, I think we know now, before the team can begin to think about developing to a level that reflects their investment. But as you say, at least they made it to the end. At least, as we said with Cadillac, there's that faint hope that maybe
You've just
if
got to reframe what success looks like
well,
for each team now.
exactly. If you contextualize it, there's a Romain Grosjean quote from Australia 2015 or 16. This is a win for us. Well, this is a win for Aston Martin, surely. Sorry, Aston Martin fans.
Yeah, not a particularly glamorous win, but a win nonetheless. And speaking of wins, we move to our winners and spinners after nearly 2 hours of conversation. Timo, your winner, please.
Oscar Piastri, like I said, he doesn't start the first two races of the season, comes out qualifies his teammate, who is now a world champion, beats his teammate, who is a world champion, onto a podium, the first for his team and his first for a season in a brand new regulation set, goes home, no explanation needed. Not a bad way to kick off officially your season.
Yeah, very cool, calm, collected Piastri performance this weekend, and very much what we're used to seeing from him. So fair call. For me, Kimi Antonelli, we knew he wasn't going to be a flash in the pan, but this was a far stronger run from him. I think I'm enjoying seeing him build and learn as it goes by. We saw some interesting learning moments from him last season, but this marks the first time that we've seen him really sort of go away from one strong weekend, still learn from it, and come back and be a bit stronger again still. Helped a bit by that pit call. Can't obviously ignore that, but he's still looking closer and closer each weekend to the finish article. And if this is the rate we're going to see him learn at, I think there's something really, really exciting coming towards the end of the season when we're just watching sort of Kimi Antonelli dominance bores fans.
I wouldn't be shocked at this point. I think Mr. Russell might have something to say about that, as will McLaren, Ferrari. You never know who else, but certainly it's not impossible given the rate at which he has shown he has firstly developed in terms of being able to compete for wins, and secondly developed in terms of being able to run away from the back in quite such a extravagant manner, I guess. In terms of my winner, I agree in terms of Antonelli and in terms of Piastri. I'm going to go with Pierre Gasly. Spoke about at length earlier, but I just think the way in which he's stringing together those points finishes, he's the clear leader in the Alpine team. There's no challenge to him, which has its positives and negatives, but certainly in terms of his standing within the sport and with other teams, as you say, almost a Sergio Perez like figure where he's going to be trying to pick up those rare podiums when he can. I don't think it's going to do him any harm at all. So I think a really strong weekend for him, a third consecutive one of those as well.
A good outing for him. Flip side of the coin, then spinners, Timo.
I just think Aston Martin, we've had to set an extra low bar and redetermine what success looks like. Cadillac, you can't really be disappointed in them. So I think in terms of last year to this year, who's the most disappointing? It's got to be Williams. Like we were just talking about, you put all of these eggs for multiple years into this basket, and this is what you're doing. You're not sort of Lawrence strolling it and throw as much money as is physically possible at the problem. You're also trying to be smart about it, and it's still not working. And I don't understand how it's happened. So, Williams.
Yeah, fair. For me, Russell, I think this, I don't want to sound like a bit of a hack F1 journalist, but it's one of those things that people like to do is they sort of go,
Is that how I'm going to describe you in the reel for this episode now?
hopefully not. But F1 journalists love to do that bit where they go, oh, this is going to be seen as like the turning point of his season when it starts to fall apart. Or you can see sort of Drive to Survive pinning sort of his championship story based around this weekend.
Huge slow
Um,
motion, dramatic music.
I this is sort of like a preemptive spinner if he doesn't pick it up from here. I think he can dig deep and fight this off. He's got a month to stew on the matter and come back fighting hard in Miami. He didn't do anything explicitly wrong this weekend, but it's sort of a preemptive warning of I think there's a lot for him to learn from. He's got to now learn to learn at the rate that Antonelli learns. It's sort of like learning squared for him.
I think it's very interesting to see how he come back, and this is the first time he's been in a championship battle bona fide. The first time he's had this amount of pressure on him. As we said earlier, I think he's beaten Lewis Hamilton. I think he can, who was just out of a championship fight. I think he can beat Kimi Antonelli, but I think anyone who underestimated Kimi Antonelli before the start of the season certainly won't be doing so now. In terms of my spinner, I've gone with Red Bull. I think to have firstly the performance, secondly the comments from Max Verstappen coming out, it almost is existential in terms of the image that they've built their team around, the way that they've built their team over the last couple of years, last decade, I should say. And it really is not going to help that team, both with the results and with those comments to move forward, especially when unfortunately on the other side of the garage, Isaac Hadjar wasn't able to score points.
Yeah, it's one of those weekends where sort of bad gets worse when it's sort of thrown into that contrast of sort of your second driver not even being able to get points out of that chassis. Meanwhile, when it comes to predictions review, it's 0 points for pole position, 0 points for the podium, 0 points for the fastest lap prediction. But Thiemo and I do somehow get our wild prediction correct, both of us. For Thiemo, this was, as previously mentioned, Aston Martin having at least one car finish. And for me, for predicting 20 cars finishing, at least 20 cars finishing the Grand Prix, I think was what I'd gone for.
Like to point out how frustrating it was as well to have predicted Piastri for third and Leclerc for second for the third week in a row, and then to get them just out of sync with what I wanted and just swapped around basically. So I was on the money, just not enough to win any.
Yeah, you were close with that one.
Closer
But
than normal.
yeah, which is saying something, I think.
I'm kind of doing an Aston Martin. I'm redefining what success looks like for me this year. I've dominated last year, so now I've just got to figure out what the hell to do this year, and that's just trying to get points now.
I think there's some merch here. There's like an Aston Martin F1 t-shirt that just sort of says like Aramco Aston Martin Formula One team
Redefine
redefining what
success.
success looks like. Yeah. There's hit us up. We'll be happy to sell you that idea, Mr. Stroll. At the moment, the F1 Fantasy website is still down for maintenance, so we cannot tell you who won this weekend when it comes to our league or who is still at the top of the standings. I know that I had a relatively mid-weekend when it came to my sort of food-based team, so we'll see how it goes. But Jaffa Cake Racing, when I did check on Sunday, looked like it was still in third, and my other two teams have climbed up the order a little bit, so not bad.
You say when you checked on Saturday.
Sunday.
Okay, I was going to say, because you checked on Saturday, no wonder you're still in third. Nothing would have happened yet.
No, there would have been qualifying that or counts for some points, but no, I had a quick look on Sunday afternoon, and it looked about the same. We'll see. Anyway, that brings us finally to the end of a nearly 2 hour long episode of the Undercut podcast. Bear in mind, this has got to last you 5 weeks until we come back for a preview of the Miami Grand Prix. So we will find something to actually fill that time with, potentially another episode. I know we said we're going to look at
We'll
what
split this into two parts.
yeah, we said we're going to
Just
have a
cut
look
it
at
mid-sentence.
there's an hour. No, we're going to have a look and see what happens if you add F1 Academy points to constructor standings to see which teams change positions, just to see whether or not. Certainly over the previous seasons, Abbey Pulling might have been able to resurrect Alpine from the ashes of their own failure. But equally, we'll have a look at what they also were able to do last season. But I need to do the maths on that one first. In the meantime, Thiemo, if this 2 hour podcast was not enough and people want more from you, where can you be found?
Fear not, there is plenty more. This week you can find me over on the Curbs IndyCar. We'll be talking about the Alabama race, and I've also got a key takeaways article about the same race from Alabama over on the Paddock Chronicle. So go and check those out for mainly IndyCar stuff, because we do have more IndyCar races in the next few weeks. They are not on a hiatus. We're going to Long Beach for spring break, but we do some racing there next. So all good fun.
Long Beach, always a brilliant Grand Prix to watch. And just generally speaking, go back and, if you haven't, watch the IndyCar that's been happening so far this season. It's proving to be incredible, especially when you've got Dennis Hauger reversing down the back straight of an oval at 140 miles an hour. Very impressive skills indeed from the little guy. Martin, if people want more from you, where could you be found?
You can find me at feederseries.net. We've got plenty of F2 content on there from the first weekend of the season, hopefully on the way in the next few weeks as well. And maybe we might even have some extra rounds that we didn't think we were going to have. That would be a rather nice prospect, wouldn't it?
Rather nice prospect. It seems to be entirely dedicated to making sure Colton Herta doesn't get to contest the 500, basically. Just sort of go,
Oof. It,
what if?
it would be a heartbreaker. It would be a heartbreaker. I'd love to see a current F2 driver in there. But unfortunately it's the stars aligning, or potentially the clouds aligning maybe um with that going quite so wrong, and Monaco not being on the Indy 500 weekend, that should make it fine, right? Oh
You need to
no,
somehow
no, it doesn't.
orchestrate an F2 race in America or Canada so that you can try and do what Kyle Larson did last year and go do one and fly to the other and try and make it there for the start.
That would be incredible. But yeah, I don't think the timing quite
Concord?
works for because what would it be? Would it be the Canadian Grand Prix that clashes? I can't remember which way around it clashes.
I
Yes,
believe
Canadian.
so. I believe they start like an hour apart or something. But to be fair, the F2 will be a lot earlier. So
F2 would be
Yeah,
earlier.
yeah, he might get away with that because in Canada, the F1 Academy race starts at 6 o'clock in the morning on my calendar, with the Indy 500 not starting till 3 o'clock. So
Doable.
if they're
doable.
very quick about things, they ask nicely, they could perhaps have F2 jumped right up the order. Like it's the last minute insertion, off you go.
Night racing around Montreal
Yeah, or
just
he
so we
does the
can.
500, then comes back and does it F2 afterwards.
It would perhaps undermine her to go into F2 in the first place because IndyCar doesn't do the super license points, but maybe that would be fair for the FIA to give him that one, perhaps,
Yeah.
after all these years.
It doesn't impact his license or anything in any way at all. It might even draw
Exactly.
more eyes to F2, a positive spin if they were to view it such. In the meantime, if you want more from me, of course, you can pick up the latest issue of Classic Car Weekly out on Wednesday. We obviously went to print with that today, so shop shelves Wednesday. And of course, you can find me across social medias at Jesse on Cars, usually chatting absolute nonsense on various social media platforms. I do have 2 months worth of videos that I still need to upload in short form content as well. So there'll be plenty of, I think it's going to be TikToks coming soon. So just at Jesse on Cars, come yell at me, I think is the best possible option. Otherwise, we'll be back soon with some more ingenious content to fill the spring break. And of course, go and watch IndyCar. That's proving to be absolutely brilliant at the moment. Go and watch pretty much every other racing series that's not going on a random 5-week hiatus. WEC, MotoGP, IMSA, I think, has got a round coming up soon off the top of my head as
Long
well.
Beach.
Yep, and obviously BTCC starts soon as well, so that's going to be very good to watch. And obviously you've got local support series for that, the likes of GB3s, GB4s. So plenty to keep motorsports fans occupied. And of course, I think we've also got the Goodwood members meeting, so I'm looking forward to that too. Plenty of good racing action until we come back for Miami. Yeah. Choking on a piece of dust at the last second.